Señoras y señores, por favor vuelvan a sus lugares mientras damos la bienvenida a nuestros panelistas para la mesa redonda denominada Transformando políticas y comportamiento para mejorar la vida. Ya está sucediendo. Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated as we welcome our panelists for the roundtable on transforming policy and behavior to improve lives. It's already happening. Presentamos a los panelistas.
I wish to introduce our panel members. We have the Minister of Social Development, José Antonio Meade.
We welcome the Minister of Social Development, José Antonio Meade, Ministro de Hacienda y Asuntos Económicos de Islandia, Minister of Finance and Economic Affairs, Iceland, Bjarni Benediktsson. Gobernador del Estado de Jalisco, Governor of the State of Jalisco, Maestro Aristóteles Sandoval. Presidente de Frontier Economics y exsecretario del Gabinete en Reino Unido, Chairman, Frontier Economics, former UK Cabinet Secretary, Gus O'Donnell. Vicepresidente de Gente y Cultura para IBM Watson, Vice President, People and Culture, IBM Watson. Obed Luisson. Vicepresidente del Fondo Mundial para la Innovación, Vice President Global Innovation Fund, Nishant Lalwani. Como moderadora, tenemos a la directora de estadística de la OCDE. As a moderator, we have the chief statistician and director of the OECD Statistics Directorate, Martine Durand.
Good morning, everyone. I hope
¿Qué tal? Muy buenos días y espero que todo mundo me...
to moderate this first roundtable after the keynote speeches of this morning. These keynote speeches set the stone for this roundtable. I think we heard very important messages. And what we're going to do today, this morning, with this roundtable, this first opening roundtable, is to go a little bit deeper into some of the points that have already been made by looking at some concrete examples, very concrete examples of what is happening first in government, and we will have with us three very renowned speakers who will give us the perspective of what it is what it entails to introduce well-being policies at the national but also at the local level. After that, I'll open the floor for discussion and we'll ask some questions to the three first panelists, and then we'll move on to a second round of discussions where we'll get the perspective from civil society and the private sector. I think that is going to be how the roundtable is going to be organized. But of course, we are delighted that Minister Meade can be with us today. And we want to thank again the government of Mexico for having supported this event, have been so supportive in the undertaking of this fifth forum that we're having here in the beautiful city of Guadalajara. So, Minister Meade, as you know, you're a representative of our host country. So I'd like, of course, to start with you and the experience of the government of Mexico and how Mexico has implemented major initiatives to tackle poverty, promote social inclusion, and improve people's well-being. So I hope, Minister, that you will share with us your program, the program that the President has put in place, the Pacto for Mexico, and how that translates into well-being policy. So, Minister, the floor is yours. You can speak from the podium.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like by thanking the kind introduction. I also wish to thank Governor Sandoval, who is going to be taking part in this panel, Eduardo Sojo, Graco Ramirez, of course, all of the main officials of the OECD. We have a number of pillars. And this forum that is opened by the OECD allows us to take a look at it. And we are talking about public policy. And first of all, we need to define what is it that we wish to do at a global level. That definition was set by the goals of the millennium. And now we're talking about the 2030 goals. So there is a global consensus with respect to what does it imply to be successful in coping with poverty, and how is it that we are going to be doing, either upon the mobilization of domestic and international or even governmental resources at different levels, social society, of course, and the different private sectors. But not only that, but something that is key at the OECD level is that how do we assess if instruments and resources being deployed are useful in order to achieve the goal that we have set. Oftentimes, this is the hardest thing to do in this equation, and it is relatively easy to reach consensus upon what is it that we need to do as a country, as society, in order to fight poverty. From a certain perspective, we can identify which are the resources that need to be put in place. But assessing whether we are not on the right track is of key relevance of this equation. So in Mexico, what we wish to do is to empower people for the full exercise of their main rights. In Mexico, what we wish to do is to ensure, on the one hand, that Mexicans can be certain of being able to eat and feed their family. Therefore, we believe that education is a main right. It has to do, of course, with nutrition, but it has to do with the generation of certainty of being able to provide for our families. When a Mexican wakes up feeling this uncertainty of being able to do so, or when Mexicans need to skip a meal or to have a full day without eating anything, we are doing something wrong, something we need to correct. Another thing that is very, very important is the true exercise of opening education. And this means the possibility of attending school. And not only doing that, but contributing to quality education. In Mexico, we still have 2.5 million children that do not attend school. And this is something that needs to be revisited, something that needs to be identified. Where are the areas of opportunity and what do we need to do? But a child that drops out of school in order to work for his or her family is something that in Mexico should not be tolerated anymore. We also think that health should not be put at risk or give rise to more poverty. When in Mexico, a Mexican has uncertainty with respect to his or her health, then this problem should not translate into a factor that gives rise to more poverty. This does not only imply access, but good quality attention. So in Mexico, we are expecting people to have a nice household, namely with floor, with walls, and with a ceiling that allows people inside to be well protected, and a household without these, a house that means sharing the same space with 8 or 9 people translates into poverty conditions, into these household conditions that we need to cope with. Furthermore, households should have utilities, should have the necessary things such as electric power, water, and access to all the different services fostering health. Therefore, that means that Mexicans do not go out and look for water, or that Mexicans do not have to cope with unsafe or unhealthy conditions. And at that time, we need to stop and think that this is something we cannot tolerate. We also wish to have a Mexico where social security is top of mind. And that means that Mexicans who reach 65 years old has the certainty of retirement, so that survival is not a synonym of poverty and despair. That is what we need to do. That is what we are measuring time and again in order to see whether our public policy is being successful or not. And that is where the relevance of good statistics relies in order to provide and contribute to good public policy. If we cannot measure, we cannot assess and evaluate. And if we cannot evaluate, we cannot improve. Jose Angel Gurria, who is a not knowledgeable person, he coordinated this effort so as to coincide with the Nobel Prize announced yesterday. And it had an influence for this Nobel Prize to take place in benefit of a person whose professional practice has to do with measuring. Angus Deaton allows us now to better understand poverty and what poverty implies worldwide as compared to what we had before he conducted his studies. In the 80s, we did not have enough information. There was a lot of speculation with respect to what being poor meant and what was needed in order to remedy these circumstances. And a review of what Deaton has done underlines the rigorous measurement of poverty that is necessary. And he measured the relationship between income and nutrition, and he found that the better the income, greater the demand for calories and the demand for a better quality life, and there is a relationship between nutrition and income. And he also showed us that causality had to do with the absence of income and malnutrition, and not the other way around. Therefore, malnutrition is a cause and not an effect of poverty. He studied deeply the effect of a different composition and structure of the family, and whether poverty was the same in a family with few or more children, and what were the necessary adjustments in order to weight the integration necessary for families. And the result of this research changed the perception, the scope of poverty that were available at a number of countries, and therefore the stress put into poor people are huge, and therefore there was the need for a methodology in order to weight what was the price and the quality paid for poverty, and a greater understanding that the poor sometimes have to pay for higher prices, and therefore gave an X-ray of a different point of view at India. He studied very rigorously the relationship between income and health. And with this focus, he saw the way we understand poverty today with a set of new dimensions. And he put into perspective the necessity to have this conversation with the poor, not only about the poor, and to ask them and ask ourselves what is at the core of what they believe well-being is all about, and understand which are the elements that they consider in consumption, and that contributes to public policy. And this is what truly has the work of Deaton, and that's why we are so happy. And upon evaluating, like Mexico is doing right now, we see encouraging progress made, and behind each step, and behind each figure, and behind each person that is moving forward, we should feel happy for that. Nevertheless, and in spite of these success stories, it is clear that we still have a long way to go before Mexicans can have access to a true exercise of their citizenship, without which our democracy is not yet complete. We have many Mexicans who are experiencing poverty, and this is something that vis-a-vis the great potential of Mexico cannot be conceived and accepted. As the forum has said, Mexico will be among the 13 largest economies before this year ends. And of course, you only need to see Jalisco to see infrastructure, growth and development and generation of jobs. And upon coping with these realities in Mexico and seeing all the things that many of our poor Mexicans are experiencing, we still know that we have a lot of efforts yet to be done. We need to ensure that the rights of Mexicans need to be dealt with. And that, of course, calls for coordinated actions, the addition of all the efforts and the involvement of the social society and the private sector. We should not have several Mexicos, but only one Mexico with prosperity and opportunities. Thank you very much.
Talk that you gave. Can I follow up with one question to start, and then to Minister Benedictson? I don't know what I'm doing here, but you mentioned, and I think that's very interesting, the fact that you outline the priorities in terms of education, in terms of housing quality, in terms of social security, ensuring pensions for everybody, but also the fact that the number one agenda priority is to reduce poverty, of course, in Mexico. For all this, you will need to mobilize not only perhaps your ministry, but all government. And that's what you said at the end of your talk, that you need to work together, not only at the national level, but also, as you mentioned, you don't want to have several Mexicos. And we know that the regional disparities are very large in Mexico, as there are, by the way, in other countries as well. So how do you see this can be achieved, working together, sort of breaking silos between different ministries, and at the same time also working with the local governments in order to actually achieve the agenda that you just laid out? It would be interesting to hear your views on that.
Yo plantearía
I would state three elements which are fundamental regarding the question that you are making. How to achieve objectives that go beyond the instruments of one secretariat. And I would say that the strategy that Mexico has followed, instructed by our president, and I greet Mr. Iglesias and acknowledge his very important participation that he had this morning. A good element of politics that Mexico has at present is crusade against hunger. That crusade acknowledges that a Mexican that is in extreme poverty is lacking many things. So it demands the intervention of different secretariats and puts Cedesol as coordinator of those efforts. He sits at the same table regularly in an exercise that is done at the state and municipality levels, 19 bodies that manage 40 programs. And he is trying to put into place all these programs in favor of those people that have been identified of those things that they are lacking, especially food. By being multidimensional and having several explanations, they demand an intervention that will be multidimensional as well, that will imply a change in the way that the government works by institutionalizing this cooperation. If you review the number of Mexicans that is lacking 6 things in life, when they have 6 things lacking in life, he cannot have an income. So this Mexican, if you reduce them in number, you will identify more capability of having a remunerated income. And you will create a virtuous circle. Less lacks of things will lead them to have a better income and thus reduce their poverty. We have to have the acknowledgement that support per se will not make you inclusive at the economy level. So you need to build bridges into the support programs and the inclusion to the economy. And finally, acknowledge, in case of Mexico, that different regional developments need a differentiated policy. And under that intuition, you have those special areas of economy that will create the necessary development economic needs according to the backwardness that they have been suffering in the past years. So summarizing, acknowledging fully that you need the government, the society, and private sector to fight poverty, a bridge, and a differentiated policy according to the different regions of the country.
Way of explaining how you go about bringing all the ministries together towards a common objective. Can I just have a final question for you, and then we'll have other opportunities to ask questions. As has been said this morning by many of the speakers, and in particular by Enrique Iglesias, the fact that citizens, we want to actually ensure that citizens are empowered and have, are part and parcel of the decision making. How do you involve, and here at this forum, and you will see in the many panels that we have organized, we have a lot of representatives from civil society as well, who are very involved and very engaged in actually asking their governments for better policies, but also, taking them accountable for the policy that they are designing. So, how do you involve citizens in this fight against poverty?
Hay un primer nivel en donde la ciudadanía
Have a first level where citizenry is not only involved, but they are a full part of the solution. While exercising these fundamental rights, the way in which we assess the process is not administrative record. When the minister, Mr. Soho, goes out to carry out his survey, what he asks people is if they have a popular insurance. They don't ask them how, he doesn't go to the institution and ask how many members do you have. It's not the membership to the social assurance. It is the person that gives him the answer that he owns subscriptions at popular insurance, and that he is granted the right to have public health. It is not what the public administrator is telling you, but it is what the citizenry is telling to the surveyors, and that's the way you exercise the right. On the other hand, in social interventions, you build around the intervention a citizenry space of monitoring. For instance, when you supply by the CONSA, there's a community group that tells you what you need to include in that basket to supply milk or any other food. And in community nourishing actions, they monitor the good use. So there's a third element. We acknowledge clearly that civil society is much more flexible, and quite often it's much more innovative in social intervention, and they have the capability of assessing it. In these programs carried out by civil society, we will create much more projection of civil society that the government is accompanying, and then you have all these tax allowances that they are granted. So to summarize, assessment is done by the civil society, the deployment of the program, it is, and the supervision and monitoring done by the government, and the design of the intervention is accompanied, it is empowered, not only by tax benefits, but by co-investment of the public sector.
Minister Benediktsson, who is the Finance Minister and Economic Affairs for Iceland. Iceland is a very different country from Mexico, of course, but Iceland was the first country that was hit by the financial crisis, and one of the hardest hit, actually, suffering the biggest banking failure in history relative to the size of its economy. Yet, Iceland has managed to navigate the crisis, and still while undergoing through this very severe crisis, managed to retain the lowest level of inequality from all OECD countries and one of the lowest level of poverty. So that's quite an achievement. But more generally, in Iceland, we see that there are very high level of labor participation, and in particular, I think we should note, Iceland has the highest level of employment rate for women, female participation. So I think that's quite an achievement as well. And also one of the lowest shares of youth who are not in education, nor training or employment. So Minister Benediktsson, what's the Icelandic secret? Can you tell us about how Iceland has managed to approach economic downturn and upturns, perhaps at the same time, but always with these policies that foster rather than undermine the well-being of people, and with very good success in terms of gender equality in particular. So could you give us your insights into how Iceland has been a successful country?
Thank you so much. Let me just start by saying thank you to the OECD and the governor of the state and the people of Guadalajara for their hospitality. Now, you mentioned a few points on Iceland and its success in economic terms, but it hasn't always been like that. You know, like a century ago, we were among the poorest. We were probably the poorest country in Europe. And you mentioned gender equality, and it so happens that this year we are celebrating 100 years of equal right for election, for participating in democracy. And I think as a general point, I would like to say that there is a correlation between the two and the work participation that you mentioned. Now, Iceland is in many aspects blessed with an abundance of natural resources, but we have been fortunate enough to follow some of the principles that the OECD is upholding and relate to productivity. And as we have done so, we have positioned ourselves with a group of other Nordic countries which have always put great emphasis and been in the forefront of putting emphasis on the welfare state and social inclusion. And I think that as a part of the world, this region has, by those policies, shown that the emphasis on a welfare state and social inclusion for all does not preclude economic growth as it is traditionally measured. And I could give a number of examples, but I think it's also important to mention that many of these examples, they relate to the fact that we have policies in place where we put emphasis on productivity and making good of the resources we have at hand. This brings me to the crisis. I think the emphasis on the welfare state and social inclusion for all has been tremendously important with dealing with the crisis. It has shown that the threats of society were stronger, that we, in terms of social acceptance to the difficulties, were at a better place from the outset, with equal access to all and the emphasis on equality and social inclusion. We have created opportunities with equal access to education, healthcare, and a very tightly knit social security system. I think all of these aspects have been tremendously important for dealing with the crisis time. Now, I could also go deeper into what actually happened during the crisis years. And of course, the fact that we had our own currency was immensely important. And this may, for many, be more of a European issue, as we have the Eurozone and a common currency for many of the nations that are still dealing with the aftermath of the crisis time. But this meant that the adjustment that needed to take place happened through the currency, the adjustment, the exchange rate. We had a much lower real exchange rate, but a lot of jobs were saved. And from an Icelandic perspective, politics have always put emphasis on job creation and job protection. And this is something that I believe has over time become even more important for Icelanders, that the right to help yourself and your family is protected by policies.
Minister, can you tell us, I mean, there was one point that was made this morning, again, by Enrique Iglesias, about, and he mentioned that as one of the three very important elements that he would want us to retain, and this is trust. Is this something, the trust in institutions, trust in governments, trust in the fact that government can solve the problems that matter to people? Do you think that plays a role, an important role in Iceland, that the population, citizens have a lot of trust in the way the government is going to handle even very difficult situations, or even perhaps that there is a lot of trust between people themselves, that they can support each other in periods of crisis, and then hence that creates very much, social capital and cohesive societies is an important element. Trust is a very important element in our 11 dimensions of well-being that we have included in our House Life report. How do you judge this element in the success of Iceland?
Well, I think transparency in public policy and a well-functioning democracy are at the core of creating trust. Let me also tell you that there was very little trust immediately after the failure of the three big banks. We had three big, systematically important banks which all went under. And there was at that time very little trust. But by trusting the democratic roots, I believe that we found a path towards a better future. I think trust is coming back slowly through the democratic process and through transparent policy making. So this is also very much true for the Icelandic example. And I think also by over time having policy prove successful, and again going back to gender equality, I think this also, over time, will build trust and help with creating new and better policies for the future.
Thank you very much. I would now like to turn to Mr. Sandoval, the governor of Jalisco. We heard you in your introductory address, but I'd like to get into a little bit more details on the policies that you outlined already, and in particular that you could explain a little bit more your política de bienestar that you introduced, as you said, by decree, by law. It's now introduced as something which is going to be official government policies across these 80 dimensions of well-being that have been chosen. And I'd like you to tell us a little bit more about how those dimensions were identified. I mean, I've here in my notes, health, education, decent work, protection of natural resources, and so on. How those dimensions were chosen, and were there some citizens' involvement in those, and how you're going to go about monitoring progress that you're making, and the type of statistics in particular that you will need to monitor these dimensions.
Primero,
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I wish to thank the OECD, and we are very happy to host the session. Thank you, Mr. Minister, and the members of the panel. Before taking office, we designed a project in order to study and make a deep research on subjective well-being. A while ago, I quoted Jeffrey Sachs, where he mentioned that we cannot make better decisions if we do not know anything about subjective well-being. What is the true concern of the people? What are the what is the status of satisfaction. When we learned about the different indicators at the different regions of Jalisco, we then worked on a decree with 6 cross-functional lines that stemmed from the aspiration and expectation from people and from their community and social environment. One has to do with the regulation of human activity in a sustainable and territorial way. The main stakeholder of well-being has to do with my environment. I cannot be happy if I cannot fully develop, if I cannot have good health, if I have not have good air quality and environmental. We found deforestation that in many areas was present, and in other areas we found absence of technology in order to work their fertile lands that were not being used because they didn't have resources and training. We found an absence of advisory efforts to market their products, and many of these areas were being swept out by real estate interests. And so we had to move the guideline of territorial aspects, moving from public works to the environment and the territorial development ministry, and therefore change our relationship with our environment and better manage our resources, our territory, our water. And many of these interests were not understood at the time. Today, these interests with capital are investing, but they are meeting these standards that contribute to better life standards and well-being to these communities that were isolated and with an absence of development. That was number one. Number two was a coordination of the government in a cross-functional way in order to transform the life of these people experiencing marginality. And what do we mean by this type of coping with? This is that people who are born poor should not die poor, that this doesn't have anything to do with generations, that people can progress and find development. And in this research that was then transformed into a law, in order to ensure health and equality of opportunities, we realized that in many areas there were health centers, but there were no medicines, and we did not have doctors, or we did not have nurses. And so we had to identify those areas with greater marginality, and we deployed practitioners at different levels, and we identified the most basic needs of these poor people, and we also identified the indicators of these crusade against hunger, cruzada contra el hambre, and we focused the effort of government in the areas where the federal government was investing the most, so as to see a transformation of the reality of these people lacking development and attention for so many years. And so we started meeting these goals. And the consequence was the reduction of poverty, of extreme poverty, the one that hurts the most, and the food poverty that hurts us the most. But as I was saying, more than 238,000 people in 1 year does not mean anything when we have over 1 million people who are still experiencing food poverty. Generating equality of opportunities demanded from families the possibility of having progress for their children. And we realized that we did not need more police officers. We did not need but more transportation, for example, to take the children from distant places to school, so as preventing that they fell into the threat of criminal practices. And so we have dropped criminality, and based upon this research effort, people were telling us what they needed, not what we thought based on diagnosis and surveys and all these things from previous administrations. Fostering economic inclusion was very, very important. We realized that in this economic model, as I was saying, that for me, fails when wealth is concentrated in just a few hands. We cannot talk about economic success. So we understood that we had to work with universities in this era of knowledge, with the private and public sectors, working with the new business people, with the new graduates, with young people who could have the capital of a land but did not know how to produce. And we started work on the first hedge fund in Jalisco. We are now working in good conditions and attracting new business efforts that are generating jobs. In Jalisco, we are now having more. We used to have 400,000 entrepreneurs, and now we have over 5,000 entrepreneurs, new entrepreneurs. And of course, this is giving rise to jobs and fostering employment in different areas, because we are not only working in Guadalajara. We are democratizing the focus of these budgets in order to incentivize this type of entrepreneurial spirits at their own communities, giving rise to well-being in their own communities, and working hand in hand with universities in order to train professionals on what they do locally. That is part of the success, short-term success, that we are experiencing in Jalisco, and we are certain that on the long run this will yield even more results. Of course, provide legal certainty and justice. This is a severe problem, and we have talked about this. The greatest cancer of our society is corruption and impunity. And what happens with these type of models that have contributed with providing more and more power to the few? That is something very, very dangerous, because we are having these networks of power that do not allow justice to be available for everybody. We cannot be unequal before the law, and oftentimes those who have more resources can solve their matters, their affairs, and we, the state, need to ensure equality and certainty, and the certainty that we are all the same before the law. We have been working now with oral trials, and we are working on education and on working with the communities with a number of programs. That is number 5. And number 6, to work with the whole cohesion with society. What are we doing? Vamos juntos, let's go together is part of this program. It is a platform where the whole state, where all the ministers at the state government are going to listen to the community. The community, we are talking about foundations, social leaders, all the different groups, and there we find out what their true expectations are. What is it that they want? And we speak the truth. What is it, the actual budget that we have available? And that is where we put resources. And hand in hand with the community, we're starting to transform certain regions, particularly those with the harshest violence and with the highest index of marginality and poverty. And now we started working with 60 people, then we had 120, and by the third meeting we did not have many people because they thought we were not going to conduct follow-up. But now that they are seeing that we are conducting follow-up, people are joining efforts. And that is the true success of this well-being policy, to gain this trust in institutions, not only public but also private, because we are a community that we organize first at a family level, then at a community, then at a society level, and then at a governmental level. And when you are government, where is that trust betrayed? Well, we have to go back to the basics. We have to speak to people, to contribute with policies that can truly transform the life of people with development, with the achievement of expectations. The virtual world allows the poor of 10 years ago, or people who were poor 10 years ago, are not the same as those of today, because now they have greater expectations, because social media are talking about a new world, and so we have to work very rapidly and with great closeness with our people.
As I said, we are going to organize this roundtable into 2 rounds. We heard now the positions of the two ministers at the national level and then at the regional level from the government of Jalisco. And I'd like to open the floor for discussions to these three gentlemen. And you have a device, you have Twitters, you have other devices on which you can pose questions. And here on my tablet, I can see your questions, so I can myself select some of the questions that you may have and ask those questions to the ministers and to the governor. But before we do, so while you're thinking about your own questions, and there are microphones as well that are going to be circulated in the room, so raise your hands when you want to ask a question to any of our three first speakers. Raise your hands, and then when I give you the floor, you need to introduce yourself. And then you will have the time the opportunity to ask your questions. So, but while you are thinking about it, Minister Mida, I'd like to come back to you with a question. You have been, you have you have had a unique experience because you've been ministers in many domains. You've been Minister of Energy, Finance, Foreign Affairs, now Social Development of Mexico across different party regimes. So I think your experience is really very exceptional in terms of telling us what you have been confronted with and how you've dealt with the issues for Mexico. So now, Mexico is a complex country. We've understood it. We've heard already from from different parts of society here in Mexico. So, and it's a very complex economic, social, but I would say also in terms of political and security, it's also complex. So, can you tell us your experience, how you see your country in the current complex economic environment of the world? How do you see the role of Mexico, and how do you see Mexico, as one of the emerging economies, successful emerging economies, having being part of the OECD? We'd like to have your broader views of, especially at the time when we're discussing about the SDGs and talking about the global world and how each country will achieve the SDGs. Can you give us your perspective? And then please send your questions, and I will look at your questions and give you the floor just after the reply from Minister Mead.
Muchas gracias por el planteamiento.
Well, thank you very much for this question. As you were saying, Madam Moderator, we have a complex country. We have a country with different dimensions, but also this is a relevant country regardless the metrics. So there are few global conversations that can be held without Mexico. We cannot talk about macroeconomic policy at the G20 level if Mexico is not present, because it is between the 13th or the 14th economy. We cannot talk about migration if Mexico is not taking part, because it is one of the main stakeholders in the five dimensions of migration, because it is a country of transit, a country that is expelling migrants or receiving migrants. So we cannot talk about public policy when we talk about poverty if Mexico is not taking part. Mexico has been laboratory and pioneer of many of the reflections on poverty, and many of the things in terms of public policy has to do with the Mexican experience. Likewise, Mexico acknowledges the value that can be found worldwide in terms of successful public policies on how to work with and accompany a number of challenges. Likewise, Mexico today and vis-a-vis the future offers a positive and optimistic environment. Mexico has a well-diversified economy, has an economy where the different sectors have particular challenges, but also opportunities. The Mexico of today is different from the Mexico of 30 years ago. The Mexican economy is not so oil-centered. Right now, we are observing the balance in the internal and external accounts, in the fiscal accounts, in the banks, and in an economic context that is quite complex. Mexico is still growing at favorable rates as compared to our peers in Latin America and in some other countries of the OECD. Mexico acknowledges that in the absence of a full exercise of monetary and fiscal policy, the transformation was necessary in terms of the structures and in the flexibilization and change. That is why Mexico has reasons to see an optimistic present and an optimistic future, acknowledging the challenges that are many, but also acknowledging the tools at hand.
Questions in the room? I see someone over there, a gentleman raising his hand. Do we have microphones? Well, while we are waiting for the microphones, Minister Benediktsson, there is a question for you coming on my tablet, which is, how is Iceland engaged with its citizens and involved in improving their well-being? How do you engage with citizens? We heard from the governor, from Governor Sandoval, that he, for instance, relies on subjective well-being indicators. Do you have this sort of approach, or do you have direct mechanisms through which you engage with citizens?
Well, I think on a very general platform, of course, the democratic way is through elections. But it has been very interesting to see how direct democracy has been evolving in Iceland, and not least on the municipal level, where we see municipalities bringing people in from the street or from their homes into a general discussion on how to develop, for example, planning within the municipality or ecological matters. We see municipalities also using technology to interact with the inhabitants. So, for example, general access in Iceland to computers is of great importance and is assisting the central government in interacting with the voters and the citizens. So there are various ways, but development of direct democracy is one of the most important ones. And it doesn't always have to end up in voting. It can also be in part on the municipal level, where we have an open and transparent policy making.
Okay, so do we have microphones now ready in the room? No? Oh, here are the questions. Those are messages that I can't see them, so that's a bit difficult. It's not on the screen, so I have to turn around. I'm sorry. So we have, for the governor, 3 years ago you incorporated well-being into legislation and placed it at the center of and the heart of government actions. What results have there been? I think the governor already gave us some indications of what happened, and he explained how poverty is already a sign of poverty. Are there other things that you would like, other indicators that you would like to mention that show that there have been some success that you can really measure in the state of Jalisco, Governor? Apart from the reduction in poverty, because you mentioned before that there was education, the quality of education. It would be good if the screen, we could see this question on the screen, because it's hard to turn around. But anyway, Governor, can you tell us a little bit more about how you judge the success of your policies?
Se tenía encuestas de Coneval con anterioridad.
We had surveys from Coneval, so we can measure poverty and extreme poverty on the same way we can measure income. And income, we have a triple hélice agreement with risk funds that today are proving their results, besides giving the right follow-up so the small or middle-sized companies become successful. The economy of Jalisco is based on a small and middle-sized economies. We are based on food industry and on technologies. Those are the niche of development areas that, besides bringing in investment, are creating new businesses and new providers taking advantage of 50% of the budget of the state. It is a protectionist measure, but we are fully convinced that the state should be regulated in the liberty of the national and subnational markets. We need to strengthen our economies. To that regard, we have carried out bids and make 50% for local capitals. This is fostering, creating, and generating more employment, and that they will be better paid jobs. I should be honest, the best indicator, the best survey is when I go out to the streets and people ask me for a job. So I see the creation of jobs month after month, the quality of the employments that we have, or investments that have been brought to Jalisco. The best survey, I don't believe that much in survey companies. I think that you should go out to the street and hear your people. Creo que ahora vamos a pasar a la segunda parte.
Three eminent representatives of civil society and the private sector, and I think it would be very good as we transition from government to non-governmental perspectives. I think that Sir Gus O'Donnell is actually the perfect person to continue, because he has expertise in the two worlds, having been the former UK Cabinet Secretary and head of the British Civil Service. Can you hear me, Gus? I have the feeling that you have a problem of hearing.
Mic?
Yes.
Because I think the hand mics are easier to hear than these.
Can you pass on the mic to Gus?
Thank you very much.
So, Gus, you've been directly involved in exploring how well-being analysis can usefully be used in actually policy making. So it would be interesting to hear about your experience, both when you were in government and now that you are in civil society, and the difference that you can see. Is it easier now to advocate for well-being as it was when you were in government in the UK?
I think yes is the short answer to that. But I mean, to react to what's been happening here, I kind of pinching myself. I think I've died and gone to heaven. I have never heard so many ministers speaking so eloquently about well-being and incorporating it in their policies, and it's fantastic. I'm absolutely delighted by that. My experience has been rather different. I mean, it's been a very hard struggle to get well-being through. Interestingly, we had a behavioural change conference in London in September, and the whole behavior change world is going global. There are nudge units all around the world. And yet, trying to get them to use the language of well-being is rather hard. And yet, when you think about it, why do you do those nudges? What are you thinking about doing? And the answer is, you are trying to enhance the well-being of your population. That's why you're doing it. If you think of some of the best examples, let's say from the UK, one of the big issues that I'm sure a number of people in the room have is aging societies with people that haven't saved enough for old age. How can you do that? And we know, interestingly, the relationship between well-being and income for older people is very, very strong, 80% correlation at low levels of income. So getting people to save more, massively important. And of course, the standard economic model, for a start, just says this isn't a problem because rational individuals will have saved the right amount, so it's kind of irrelevant. But if you go beyond the standard model, you then get people saying, okay, so the answer is let's provide a subsidy for saving. That costs you billions. And in fact, the nudge answer, the behavioral answer, has been to just change the default. So people are defaulted into their pension schemes so that they're automatically there. And that's made a huge difference and will make a huge difference to the well-being of older people because they will have more money when they're there. So I think that's an example where well-being policy has worked very well. Politicians in general have been very nervous about talking about well-being because it's seen as fluffy and very difficult to measure. And I think, Martine, you and the OECD deserve enormous credit for getting us comparable measures across the world such that we can all start to say, look, this is what's happening here. And this is massively important. And seeing Joe Stiglitz there, Joe's report, massively important. Angus Deaton, who worked with me on this one, the Wellbeing and Policy Report, it proves two things: that actually you can get well-being measured well, you can work out what the policies are, and if, as an economist, you work on this, you get a Nobel Prize. Now, where's the incentive? Come on, economists in the room, this has got to be the answer. But I think it's important that we get across that there are strong policy conclusions from all of this work, because quite often when you talk about well-being, they say, well, so what? So what's different? It's interesting that a number of the ministers have raised the issue of trying to work across boundaries, about departmental boundaries. That's very important. And the only advice I can give is that actually, when you get the benefits as a politician of the spending come back to you, that's all generally rather good. So you need to kind of design the departmental structures or budgets around that principle. I remember getting ministers very interesting when I said to them, well, what if I could prove to you that if you improve well-being, it will increase your vote at the next election? Now, it's interesting, the LSE have now done some work on this, and it turns out that there's good news and bad news here, right? And the good news is that by avoiding a reduction in well-being while you're in office, you will gain electorally. That's the evidence, actually, it's from a number of EU countries. The bad news is if you put well-being up during your time, individuals tend to get the credit, take the credit for themselves, not give it to their governments. So it's kind of hard. So what could we do that would be really important? And the Secretary General there, now I have a message for the Secretary General. I have spent many decades in the finance ministry in the UK. I have had the joy of having the IMF, the European Commission, the OECD come to tell me what we're doing wrong with our economy. I'm sure there are a number of people who have had this experience. It's called surveillance of our economies, and we've noticed the IMF meetings in Lima talking about what everybody should do, mainly in terms of GDP, I'm afraid, so they haven't yet caught up with where they need to be. But one concrete suggestion is that all of your people doing surveillance should now report to Martine, and they should come to us and tell us what we're doing that's wrong in terms of well-being, right? And that we should be doing the policies that actually enhance well-being as opposed to tweaks to our budget deficit. That would really be a step forward. But you asked me about, is it easier? It's obviously easier to talk about these things when you're outside government rather than giving private advice to ministers. When you go, as I have, into the private sector and you deal with companies, the interesting thing is that companies' first reaction when you talk about enhancing well-being is that that's not what we're about, right? That's not what we do. We're here for our shareholders. We're here maybe for a group of stakeholders. But when you talk to them about the things that really matter, let's imagine that conversation with the head of Volkswagen, right? What really matters to you for your long-term sustainability of Volkswagen? I suspect he'd say it's trust, a word that you used. And actually, if you had as a policy, we will do things that enhance sustainably the well-being of our customers. You know, that would be a great conversation to have had with the UK banks before they all decided to do payment protection insurance, which is now costing them billions in compensation. That principle were adopted in the private sector, it could make a big difference. What I found in the private sector is that when you talk to them about well-being, they automatically think about the well-being of their staff. And that's great, that's really important. And there's a lot of evidence that if you improve the well-being of your staff, then you improve your productivity, and in the long run, this is going to make you a much better company. But I think, so there are lessons. The private sector thinks they've been doing this for a long time, and alas, they have. You know, I could give you various examples where they've used behavioral techniques to enhance profits, which haven't necessarily been at the interests of their consumers. If you look at what banks do, for example, with credit cards, the bottom of the credit card statement, there's a wonderful thing called a prime in the technical terms. Basically says, here's the minimum amount you should pay. This is extremely good news for the bank if you pay the minimum amount, because you then borrow a large amount at high interest rates. Is this in the long run interest of the customer? So it's important that the regulators start thinking about well-being, and I'm glad to say a number of regulators are starting to do that. So I think there is a lot to learn about how to do these things well. I think the public sector has got lots of really interesting examples now. We've now got a What Works Centre on Wellbeing. Paul Litchfield is here, and that's doing a lot of that work.
Yeah, well, that's one point. What do you think this What Works for Wellbeing Center will achieve then? We'll hear Paul in the final session on Thursday with more details. But do you see this is really an instrument that will be critical to advance the agenda? Will it provide, as you say, all the evidence to demonstrate that if you actually pursue those well-being policies, it could be win-win, both in terms of the economy, but also in terms of the well-being of citizens. So how do you see the perspective for this well-being center that is being created?
I think two big things the What Works Centre will do. First of all, there are lots and lots of interventions going on. You know, we have ones about helping old people with loneliness. You know, there's a vast number of them. They're all in Chapter 5 of the Legatum Report or Chapter 9 of the Nudge book by David Halpin. Enormous numbers now. The question is, and they're happening in lots of different places, can we have a common scheme for evaluating them? And in the end, this will mean that you'll need to have ways of thinking about well-being alongside cost. We need to think about valuation issues, and there's been quite a bit written about this, but those are really important sessions. So that's the first thing, that common methodology, and they've gone out to a number of academics to try and get some really serious research done, which can be broadly adopted, just as you did with the measurement. Second area is taking examples from around the world, and we heard this morning about some really interesting ones in Mexico, which will be fantastic to take those, put them on the website of the What Works Centre, so that around the world we can all be learning from each other, looking at those things which work, but I think almost as importantly, the things we've done which don't work. And we've also got a lot of examples of things that haven't produced the results we thought they would.
Yes. Thank you, Gus. I think that's very interesting. Now, you just mentioned the private sector and how the private sector should also put well-being at the center of its strategy. And that's a very interesting point you're making, because often we talk about government, we talk about citizens, and we forget the firms and the companies in this triangle, although they are very important stakeholder, of course, in the way our economies function. So we're very happy to have with us Obed Luisant, who is the Vice President of People and Culture at IBM Watson, who is representing the business. And business, as I said, have a very important role in transforming their own behavior to improve people's well-being, both as employers, as you said, for the staff, but more broadly for society. Although that's a very difficult proposition to make. So, Obed, I would like to ask you, how do you reconcile the need to make profits, which is actually what businesses are trying to achieve, and often short-term profits, with the view of having a more social or corporate social responsibility behavior, and hence look at all the stakeholders, your clients, the citizens that lives in the community where you operate, and the staff that work for you. Can you tell us a little bit more of your experience?
Terrific. Well, first of all, it's a great honor to be up here with this esteemed panel. And it is also always nice to talk about the topic of well-being when you haven't slept the night before. So one of the things, I'd like to build on the comment earlier. Profits are a good thing for a corporation. However, I'd like to change the conversation to one of value, right? And as was mentioned earlier, it's a false choice for a corporation to choose one stakeholder group over another. So many of us in the private sector have multiple stakeholders, whether that is the employee for sure, and then worrying about their well-being is important, as is that of our clients and the value that we're delivering for our clients, our investors, those who own us, and so in delivering value to that community, as well as the communities that we live in and that we work in. And it's really important that you don't trade off any one of those communities for another one. So, for example, being here in Mexico, this is our 40th year next week in Guadalajara. So being in this particular community is really important to us. And then next week would mark 90 years in Mexico, right? So looking good for our age, but despite the fact you can't choose, you can't choose one population over another if you're going to be a sustainable organization. There's many organizations that aren't necessarily sustainable, and this bug isn't good for my well-being either. But there's many organizations who aren't sustainable over time. However, if you are to be sustainable, it's important to choose or balance between those communities. The way in which we think about it is that we drive first client value, we recognize employee engagement is a contributor to that client value, and those things equal your business results. So I'll talk about those things in various pieces, because once you get the business results, then you can invest and reinvest. The governor and the ministers talked quite a bit about investment, and then likewise for the private sector, it's important that we invest into the future so that we drive well-being and client value. So for example, our billion-dollar investment in shifting towards cloud and in ensuring that putting soft layer pods around the world. Another $1 billion in the commercialization of Watson, $3 billion in connecting devices and Internet of Things, and in multi-billions of dollars in investment in research. Why are those things important? Because it helps to drive better solutions and value for our clients and the communities at hand. So with some of our social and mobile solutions going hand in hand with the government's and the ministers' movement towards connecting individuals into remote communities and giving 95% of them access to connectivity, that becomes incredibly important for managing things like disease. Right? When you have social systems where you're able to, click an app and then define that, Ebola is in this particular territory, and then you can run the analytics and to say, where is it flocking, and then you can send disease control substances to those particular areas, that is value for our communities, and then that is values for our organizations and our people at large. So driving towards areas of value and defining solutions that make a difference is what at the heart of us, in the private sector, whatever your industry is important. So just like if you're in the food and beverage, identifying healthy ingredients, as a result to less healthy ones. So looking to the heart of who is our end consumer and investing in those areas for the future and in driving values in those places. One of the areas that it takes us is we've invested heavily in cloud solutions, in data, and in engagement, and in recognizing that those were three incredible forces that drive towards value and well-being to our clients. And then what it has done for us is actually made the next era of our business and the movement that we're driving in technology very clear. Because the end game isn't data, it isn't cloud, and it isn't engagement, but it is what those things enable the digital enterprise to be in the move towards cognitive. And our answer to cognitive, which is, as you introduced, is around Watson. We have a huge actor in Watson in using cognitive computing, or computing that understands the way in which humans talk, which is something that has not been done before. So 80% of the world's data is unstructured data that was dark to computers for many generations, right? So to understand that level of data, whether it comes in the form of song and unstructured text, pictures, and then to drive that into value and understanding and knowledge. Then reasoning ability. When you start to get machines that can reason and to look at all of the insight that it has and then make some level of choices, and then helps you to then drive what is the next and the best decision. And in having cognitive embedded into your solution or into your insights to make better decisions is what we see the future of professionals to drive better well-being to the consumer as well as to employees. And then lastly, is then to be able to make the right decisions, right? So when you start to embed those things into well-being, you can start to make better decisions, better insights, and drive value to your particular consumer and your employees.
Well, thank you. This is, of course, you giving us the example of your own industry. We hope that what you're doing is also going to permeate through other industries. Hopefully we won't get the, and what you're saying, creating values and relying on values in terms of, the social responsibility, creating values to your customers and so on. It's very important. Unfortunately, I would say this is not necessarily shared by, despite what you said, by all business sectors. We just heard the Volkswagen case. So we hope that in the future you will be able to convince other people in the business community to go in the same direction. That's something that we can come back to that in a moment. I'd like now to move on to Nishant Lalwani, because I'm conscious of the time. And I'd like him really to speak and tell us, he's a vice president of the Global Innovation Fund. This is a very recent fund. It's a joint venture between the US, UK, Swedish, and Australian governments in partnership with Omidyar Network, a philanthropic network. And if I understand correctly, the Global Innovation Fund, but I'd like you to give us a little bit more detail, is investing in social innovations. So can you tell us a little bit what have been the successes so far? I know it's a recent fund, but it is very interesting that you would create a fund to invest in, the lives and opportunities of millions, to improve the lives and opportunities of millions of people around the world, and how you go about it, how you decide which projects you should fund, and so on. So I'd like you to explain a little bit what you do as part of this civil society sponsored by government community.
Thank you, Martine, and I'd like to thank Minister Mead and the Governor of Jalisco and the OECD for inviting the Global Innovation Fund here today. We are an independent, non-profit fund that is sponsored by the 4 governments that Martine mentioned and the Omidyar Network. Our goal is to improve the well-being of the poor in developing countries, and we do that by supporting social innovations in a very, very wide and ambitious, audacious mandate. We can fund innovations in any sector at all, any country in the world, with any types of institutions, for-profits, non-profits, individuals, universities, and even governments directly. And while Martine mentioned that we are very young, it was our first birthday just a few weeks ago, there are a few things I can talk about in terms of some of our early achievements. First of all, I think that one positive aspect of the way we're constituted is that we managed to pull a number of different governments together to work on innovation. So as Gus was talking earlier about sharing what works and what doesn't, and actually working together on solutions that can be transferred across different contexts, that's a very, very important goal for the Global Innovation Fund. Secondly, in terms of our mandate, we have a couple of things that are very unique. First of all, we are incredibly flexible. So we're not limited by, funding only in health, funding only in education. We can fund across sectors, and we sort of pride ourselves that we can catch some of the innovations that don't fit into the traditional development silos, if you like, of countries and of sectors. We also have flexibility across different financial instruments. So we can fund innovations that may be working on policy, but happen to be for-profit companies that are working on very important problems. One example of this, our first investment was in a company called Segovia, and Segovia work in an area that's very well known here in Mexico, that is cash transfers. What Segovia do is they have a very sophisticated enterprise platform that helps drastically reduce the cost of supplying cash transfers to the ultra-poor and to those victims of humanitarian disasters. Now, the areas in which Segovia work, it can cost up to 40 cents on the dollar to send cash to, for example, flood victims. And they can reduce that to less than half by using mobile money, by using the software platform, and also critically by reducing corruption and fraud that happens in so many cash transfer programs. Now, Segovia are a for-profit company, and they're a software company right, based in the United States. They hire talent from Facebook, Yahoo, and other high-end engineering companies. They are very, very well positioned to come up with the right product solution, but they work directly with developing country governments and large NGOs who do cash transfers. They, by making cash transfers more efficient, have an impact on policy and on the relative attractiveness of certain cash transfer programs. And by doing so, they are able to directly influence the well-being of the populations of those governments. So this is a good example of where a partnership between a for-profit institution that we've invested in, along with Omidyar Network and some other high-profile investors, can work directly with governments, such as those doing cash transfer programs to influence policy. A second thing which I think is very important in what we do is our focus on evidence. So we are really trying to raise the standards of proving what works. Unfortunately, a lot of money in development and aid goes towards ideas that sound great, but don't have a lot of proof behind them. And we are trying to raise the standards for for-profits, non-profits, governments, in terms of understanding the answer to the very simple question, does this work or not? Now, that can be a very expensive and difficult question to answer, but it's one that GIF is actually willing to support innovators in doing. We're willing to both fund innovators to answer that question, but also connect them to some of the leading impact evaluation institutions in the world to ensure that their evaluations are done to the appropriate level of rigor.
Well, you should get in contact with the the new What Works in Wellbeing Center in the UK, in particular with the techniques to evaluate what works and what doesn't work. And the cost-benefit analysis based on well-being, as Gus mentioned, is one way to evaluate what works and doesn't, and a different way of looking at what works and doesn't work by putting well-being at the center of the evaluation. I'm just looking at some of the questions, if we have some questions that can, but I'd like to follow up, since I don't see any question directly directed to you, with how do you see the activities of your fund contributing to the implementation of the SDGs?
Well, we work across almost all of the SDGs. We've already made certain investments, or have approved investments in health, in education, in energy, and a number of other sectors, in poverty alleviation. I think where we're especially well positioned is in the innovation space. To date, in the year that we've been operating, we've seen 3,000 different innovators apply to us for funding across 26 different sectors from 120 different countries. And so, we can truly be responsive to some of the new ideas emerging from some of the more unlikely suspects within developing countries. So, I think where we can be most helpful is finding some of the more groundbreaking ideas that perhaps don't fit into traditional development funder mandates. One thing that I would like to say, is, in fact, as a call to the audience, is that we have received a lot of applications for funding from social enterprises, from non-profits, and from other independent institutions. We receive relatively less at the moment from directly from government departments or from those institutions working on government policy. And we would love to see more innovation. So if you have ideas that you're working on on how to improve well-being in developing countries with a direct policy impact, please do get in touch with the Global Innovation Fund, and we'd be really happy to engage you on that.
Well, Gus seems to have an idea, so.
Sorry, I couldn't resist that, because quite often when people talk about these well-being initiatives, they're very small, they're very localized, and they're very community or personal based, which is fine and very good. But occasionally, I think behavioral economists like George Lowenstein have said to us, we need to raise our sights. And the ministers talked this morning, we heard very powerfully about the big issues of climate change. Now, it strikes me climate change will be a classic example for the Global Innovation Fund, because we know that Paris is coming along. We know that there are going to be some individual commitments by countries, and it's not going to be enough to hit 2 degrees, and we need to think more radically. It just happens that Richard Layard and I and some others have got the answer to the global problem, so we just need a little bit of money, right? So if you could come together, we can explain to you the Global Apollo Project, which basically says we need to take that energy that the Americans put towards putting a man on the moon and get the scientists working on how do we make renewables cheaper than fossil fuels so the fossil fuels stay in the land. So small grant and we'll save the world, okay?
Well, in Lima, Gus, the Secretary General released a report from the OECD, which showed that out of the $100 billion that's necessary to achieve actually the transition towards a to combat climate change, only 62 were actually on the table. So perhaps the Global Fund and Gus O'Donnell are going to solve the problems for us and find the money, the gap between the 62 and the 100. At least if not all, contribute to filling some of the gap, and we hope that that will be, you can talk to each other and help in this endeavor. There's one question which the Secretary keeps showing to me, but I suppose that's the one on social enterprises and entrepreneurship. No, that's a GDP question you wanted me to ask? Six. Oh, now it's moved. So see, it's the second. Improving well-being requires new approaches. No, that's not this one. Oh, yeah. But for Mr. Lucent, how realistic is it for businesses to make well-being a goal of their activities alongside profit? But I think that's a question I asked in the first instance, and I think he tried to answer that by saying that it is a valid proposition for business to actually make profit while at the same time achieving well-being and taking into account well-being of the different stakeholders. Including investors, Mr. Lucent, you would say?
Including investors. I mean, there's some businesses or some industries where it's more difficult than others. In some industries, it is and that's where you need the partnership between government and between the private sector, and ensuring that you've got policies that is in protection of employees as well. Because there are some sectors that isn't incentivized to worry about employee well-being, but that is but if you had a more evolved workforce or a more evolved leadership team, then you'd get that level of focus. An example we had a conversation with Ritz-Carlton as an employer, and then one of the things that the Ritz-Carlton says, and then they don't employ a highly, as far as the workforce is concerned, it's not there isn't a requirement to have a degree and to be a member of the workforce, to be a part of the housekeeping staff and so forth. But they realized that the number one indicator of clients coming back to them was related to employee engagement. So it was the discretionary effort that the employees made that they felt that they wanted to give that extra effort that brought clients back. So it doesn't necessarily, so it can transcend some sectors and different classes of employees.
Just to back that up, we do a thing called a civil service survey, which is hundreds of thousands of staff, and we now ask the 4 O&S questions. So we've got very strong evidence about the relationship between well-being and employee engagement, and our highest performing teams, curiously enough, all of those things fit together. But I think from the company point of view, the point I'd make is, yes, the companies get it that they need their staff to be engaged and all the rest of it. My worry is the investors.
Yes.
So the investors are, if you look at the speeches Andy Haldane's been making about short-termism and the like, the question is, can they invest in those things which have long-term payoffs, and are they tempted by investor pressure to do things which aren't actually in the long-term interest of the company and the customers?
Right. Yeah, that's exactly the point I was making. When you say you're looking at all the stakeholders, including the investors, I think that's absolutely right. That's where we have to go. I think we have unfortunately reached the end of our panel time. So I'd like to finish with a question for Minister Mead, since he has been so graceful to make the trip from Mexico to Guadalajara, and give you the last word, Minister, with a reflection on from what you have heard so far, including, the perspective from the civil society, from other countries, from the regional level, and from the business sector. What would you take out in the next few weeks as a Minister of Social Development from this forum discussion?
Muchas gracias por la posibilidad.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to wrap up. I would say that it is not difficult for me to come to Guadalajara, to Jalisco. It is a pleasure at all times to do that. I think that the panel is reflecting a fortunate coincidence. I think that the private sector is reflecting a very positive thing with respect to clear objectives from the government and measurement of progress, of goals, and the assessment of progress towards those objectives. I think that the government is seeing a private sector that considers that its interaction with the different stakeholders, either employees or the customer, should give rise to an interaction that gives rise to less poverty and greater well-being. And of course, that suggests a common shared agenda. Of course, the government needs to be evaluated in terms of public policy with respect to the degree of well-being, and that the same metrics could be applied to the private sector when it interacts with workers, with stakeholders, with investors and customers. And of course, then it becomes feasible to assess the government along the same lines and to make sure whether after the interaction with the private sector, with the person who invested or purchased anything, if that people are more greatly empowered as before that interaction, then that suggests a communion of interests contributing to greater well-being, that contributes to the private sector, and that is an obligation of the public sector. And of course, we should all be measuring, and of course, that should yield results for both sectors. Therefore, I believe that a healthy sector, and reasons to be optimistic, that the objective that is bringing us together, that is constructing well-being through through public policies, through private involvement and civil society involvement, we can assess and we can measure. Therefore, achieving this goal is feasible, and we should acknowledge the OECD, the view of bringing us together to reflect upon this.
This panel was really setting the tone again for the future panels that we will have in the next few days. And as Gus put it, I think we're very reassured, aren't we, Gus, to see that a lot of things are happening, and we are convinced that the title of this panel was Transforming Policy to Improve Lives. It's already happening. And I think we've seen that it is already happening. So we will hear more in the coming days, but at least we are reassured that things are moving on, and that's something that we were not so sure a few years ago. So it's very encouraging to see that there is action at the level of governments, both national, regional, at the level of civil society, private sector, and former government now in the civil society. So I think it's already happening. So let's make it happen even more during the next couple of days. And thank you very much. We want to thank our panelists. I think that was a great panel. And we will now break for lunch. But again, I want to thank you all.
Muchas gracias a nuestros panelistas. Despidámoslos con un fuerte aplauso, por favor.